Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Dr. Somer, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Well, I'm an Israeli clinical psychologist. I'm a scientist practitioner, meaning that I do therapy, but I also do a lot of research. I was affiliated with the University of Haifa until 2 years ago, when I stopped teaching, and now I do mainly research and psychotherapy. My main field of interest has always been associated with trauma and dissociative disorders. It's a little story on how I got to maladaptive daydreaming, but the two issues are kind of related. The dissociation and excessive daydreaming are connected in some way. So that's a brief introduction.
Now, when it comes to maladaptive daydreaming, I've heard that it was linked somewhat with trauma, but is that just because they're trying to escape from reality and like the one that they build up during daydreaming? Which I know I think we need to change the word of daydreaming because I just feel like whenever you say it, people kind of don't take it seriously a little bit. It's kind of linked in, like I looked up, it comes in with mind wandering and a bunch of other things, but this seems unique to its own.
Well, there is a confusion, a kind of a fuzziness in the professional scientific literature concerning maladaptive daydreaming and mind wandering. They are used interchangeably, but I agree with you, they're not the same. So, for the sake of clarifying this, let us say that mind wandering is what the mind does when it is off task, when it's not concentrating on doing something, and the mind is at rest and sort of wandering from one thought to the other. Most of the thoughts are usually related to mundane
Like getting groceries or filling up the car with
stuff like
gas.
this, planning your dinner, or recalling, reminiscing something, going over a conversation you've had, or even preparing for a future conversation. That's mind wandering. Daydreaming, again, it involves something that is much more fanciful, much more fantasies involved in the storylines, and even that mental activity lies on some kind of a continuum because people um, differ from one another in terms of the degree to which they can absorb themselves in their daydreaming. Um, I, for example, have a little capacity to become completely absorbed and immersed in my fantasies. They don't have very strong visual components to them. But others, on the other end of the continuum, have hyperphantasia. They can experience all sort of sensory components to their fantasy that for some is experienced as if they are actually present. They have a sense of presence in the experience. That is something completely different, and we call this form of daydreaming immersive daydreaming. Immersive daydreaming in itself is not pathological. It's just a trait, a capacity to visualize the fantasy very vividly. And what people do when they discover this ability, usually we believe it's an innate ability, so it's discovered early on in childhood, that they can develop complex storylines, complex scenarios. And this is where we get to the magic of it, because if you have this built-in virtual reality between your ears, that you can then be the director, the script writer, the director, you can actually create an idealized life, and imagine things that you would have liked to experience, that were fun and you want to re-experience, that you want to experience in a corrected way. The sky's the limit. And apparently, I can imagine this only. I mean, not literally, but I can imagine how fun it can be. And so, what do we have here? We have an ability to actually be transported to an inner world that we are in complete control of. That that can be extremely rewarding, and it would be doubly rewarding, of course, to those who experience distress or have bad memories or have had, live in difficult life circumstances. They can simply transport themselves to the alternative reality. But you don't need to have trauma uh, to have this trait, because it's an innate trait, and you don't need to have trauma to get sort of addicted to this fun activity that is like a sort of a substance, but it's not toxic, and it's legal, and it's available.
You don't have to go anywhere. It's just right in your house. You just wherever you're at.
Exactly. So people who have this, some people who have it, just don't want to stop. They want to go back to the experience. And that, so when does it become pathological? When does it become maladaptive? It's when it starts interfering with your daily responsibilities, when it impedes your functioning in some way, when you prefer to engage with your imaginary friends instead of socializing or being with your family, when you prefer to imagine yourself excelling in whatever profession you want to be instead of studying or practicing. Or when you do less work because it's just much more, because work is dull, and in your fantasy you can do unimaginable things. So that's when it becomes a problem, and when people lose so much time in their fantasy, and it interferes and compromises the quality of the functioning, some of these individuals become depressed or anxious because they feel, a loss of control, and that actually their life, there's a growing gap between the idealized life they play out in their minds and what's happening in reality. So we have another component of psychological distress, and that's, yeah, the pain, the depression, the anxiety about lost opportunities. So that's when we are getting concerned about it. Otherwise, if people can daydream a few hours a day but still meet all their obligations and feel good, then it's an interesting mental activity, but it's not a disorder.
I'm sure there's probably a wide range of who might be susceptible for this type of daydreaming, but I'm just curious, have you been able to pick out like certain populations? I know we talk about early childhood and things of that sort, but is it more with people with disorders? I would think with ADHD, if you're sitting in a school setting, which was a lot for me, I daydreamed all the time. It was very hard for me to focus, but that was my escape. But then you got to look at someone that might be have a child with like a single parent that might be working two jobs, so then they're at home all the time, and maybe they like watching TV so much they get sucked up into it, and then that starts becoming part of their daydreaming experiences. And then OCD is a giant micromanager type thing, so I would think if you can create your own little separate reality and it goes exactly how you want it, it's way better than the actual reality, then there's not really a point to kind of leave it in a sense. But I mean, like, have you been able to find a strong correlation with a certain population, that there's like certain evidence that this is definitely something that could lead to this type of daydreaming?
Yes, we have found some interesting correlations. Again, when you look at correlations, you must uh, bring into consideration the fact that we cannot assume causality. They're just, two phenomena that go together, but we don't know what causes what. So, for example, if you take OCD, for example, I believe that there is, in certain cases, an OCD factor, and we found it in research. That is, people with this trait, with the ability for immersive daydreaming, they try to get it right, as it were. They get the fantasy right. So they repeat it over and over again, but they can't get it right. They can't get it right because of their OCD. But I don't know that this causes OCD or that OCD increases the likelihood for immersive daydreaming. I don't think that is the case. But people who have the trait and also have OCD run the risk of just getting trapped in this fantasy because they want to perfect it all the time.
Like a loop.
So there is a correlation there. There's a very high correlation with ADHD. In fact, we found that about 77% of people with the maladaptive daydreaming meet the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. And that would make sense because you can't really concentrate if you have these intrusive fantasies, and if you're drawn to your fantasy world all the time, that comes at the expense of paying attention to the external world, obviously. So there's a strong correlation with ADHD, but with the inattentive type, because there's also the hyperactivity element in ADHD. So it's not correlated with that, but it's correlated with inattention. But that immensely high correlation led us to consider that maybe we're talking about the same disorder. So we went ahead and studied a group of people that were diagnosed with ADHD. And in that group, we found out that maladaptive, only about 20%, 22% had maladaptive daydreaming. So it's not the same disorder, but there's probably a subtype of ADHD that is caused not by the neuropsychological abnormality that perhaps happen in the brain and interfere with attention, but there's a subgroup of people with ADHD that their inattention is probably better explained by their very active fantasy life that draws their attention resources inwardly, and that creates inattention to the external world. So there's a correlation there, and there perhaps we have some idea about causality. How does excessive daydreaming cause inattention? We know it's probably not the other way around. So there's a correlation there. We also, another clinical group that we looked at are people with who are on the autistic spectrum. This group of individuals are known to engage in daydreaming. It's one of their characteristics. Indeed, we found a positive, significant correlation there, but we still need to study this more. Obviously, it doesn't mean that people who have maladaptive daydreaming have autistic features. We don't imply that, but clearly, people with autism who have difficulties understanding the external world, who have difficulties understanding people and how they interact and feel discomfort, sometimes feel overwhelmed by social interactions, feel much safer in their inner worlds that they create.
Yeah, sometimes too much input.
Exactly. So in their fantasies, they can control that. They can really regulate the amount of input, the intensity of socializing that they fantasize. But that is still an open field for investigation because we still don't know exactly what characterizes the themes, the fantasy themes of people with autism. So I agree with you. It seems that this form of fantasizing cuts across several diagnostic groups. So it's a trait. It's a trait that can come together with other psychological phenomena and conditions. And it's a trait that can offer distress regulation. So it's extremely, potentially extremely appealing to those who are suffering. So if they have this trait, they can turn it on and decrease their pain, their emotional pain, because they go elsewhere or they can soothe themselves better. So it's kind of a talent that, if used in proportion, can be very helpful, because it's also conducive to creativity.
Yeah. Is it I don't know how to really necessarily phrase this question, but could it be the similar things like with someone coping through a loss? Like, for instance, memory, when it comes to remembering a memory and living inside of that memory? Because every time you go back to a memory, you sometimes change it a little bit. And I'm curious because there are sometimes you take a memory that might you think it went this way, but it didn't go that way. It actually went a different way. And I would feel like if you keep trying to relive in that memory and keep trying to look at things, like I think everybody wakes up in the middle of the night and thinks about, oh my God, that time in middle school. It's like, why am I worried about that? I'm like 30 years old. It doesn't matter. But you change it and you kind of sometimes you can either ramp it up and make it worse in your head, or you can try and find a way to be able to kind of cope with it, or just, so it's not so much of a stinging memory. I'm curious if someone's ever tried or looked at any data that shows that someone tried to create a daydream from a memory or an existence of memory. I think about it sometimes. I have like childhood moments or something like that. And then I try and do like a fly on the wall in that memory. And you start exploring and then creating details that necessarily aren't a part of that memory. But then if I go and try and remember what that memory is, I have now altered it a little bit, where I have to kind of find like, wait a minute, I created this part to it. The only part that I actually remember is this. I'm not trying to sound insane. I'm just saying, like, I'm doing 6 hours of cardio and I'm doing this half the time. So you're trying to do anything to make sure you're not paying attention to that.
Right, right. Well, you are touching upon a very sensitive issue that has been at the center of perhaps the biggest controversy in psychology in the last 100 years or so. And that is the question of true versus false memories. This controversy revolved mainly around recovered memories of abuse. It was a center of very big legal debates when the defense attorneys of people accused of child abuse were questioning recovered memories of their victims, of the survivors, claiming that memory is pliable, is not something that you can rely on. And if people think too much about an event, even an imagined event, they can mistake it for reality. This type of defense, of course, caused a lot of concern and harm to many victims and their advocates, and they're like the clinical psychologists who were treating them. So that first, I would say that I accept and agree that retrieving a memory is not like playing a video file. You don't retrieve the things as they were recorded, because people construct and reconstruct their memories. And with immersive and maladaptive daydreaming, we have a special challenge here that is associated with the question of what, as you said, what is the source of what I remember? I remember something clearly, but is the source the event, or is the source the vivid, absorptive fantasy that I can create? Sometimes people have a hard time differentiating between the two, especially if they fantasize about real people and plausible events. Because if you fantasize about, Harry Potter environment, you know that you haven't been there, or Star Wars or stuff like that. But if it's about your own family or friends that you'd like to sort of idealize certain interactions, then it's difficult to tell. So we are actually investigating this as we speak. There's 1 or 2 studies that we're running just to shed light on exactly this kind of issue. I had one clinical example, clinical case in which there was evidence that the memory was false and associated with fantasy. You know, to be able to claim that the memory is false, you need to have evidence that refutes the memory. That's not easy. So in one case that I had, and I got permission from this person to write the case up, so I don't have it. I'm not infringing on her confidentiality when I talk about it. She was visually, she still is visually impaired, and isolated socially, partly because of her visual impairment. And this person reported about 3 very dramatic events that happened to her that had to do with her anxiety. For example, during COVID, she all of a sudden called up her family, asking for help, telling them that she got COVID and that she lives independently and that she is hospitalized, that she's in intensive care, and she has a hard time breathing. And her family, of course, alarmed. She hung up, and called all the emergency departments. Eventually, found out that she's at home, actually, and was completely immersed in an anxiety-ridden fantasy that she might contract COVID, and she fantasized that she actually got it, and it was so believable that she confused reality with fantasy. She had 3 such incidents, and this is not actually about a memory, but it's even more dramatic because it's something very current. This person is not psychotic. She's
Well, it's a plausible scenario.
and yeah, but it illustrates the at least possibility that someone under certain circumstances might confuse reality with fantasy. In her case, visual stimulation is very limited. So the only images that are real for her come from her fantasies. So that's one explanation why she mistook these memories for reality, because her fantasy was sometimes more real than what she perceives when she is awake and focused externally. So this is possible, but from the preliminary data that we have derived from interviewing people with maladaptive daydreaming, it seems that, going back to the controversy of false memories of abuse, that people want to improve their mental state and are motivated to feel good and not to create distress. So people are unlikely to conjure and to come up with horrible fantasies that are false about their past. In fact, the opposite is more likely, that people who have had adverse childhood circumstances would tend to fantasize about ideal families, or distract themselves and have fantasies, Disney World type fantasies, in order to regulate their distress. So these are sort of initial impressions from the data that we collected. This is a study that is still going on and being analyzed and written up, is that people with maladaptive daydreaming would not tend to have false memories of abuse, but they might be more likely to err in attributing some other more plausible events to reality, while they were fantasized. But again, you touched upon a hot topic in our field.
Whoops. I mean, that's most of my life. I end up stepping in something I didn't know was a controversy. But when it comes to virtual simulators or, these VR games that we have out now, is that another, like, could that be masking a lot of things that could be like this form of daydreaming as well too? Because you technically are stepping into your own reality. If you've ever seen Sims 4 or Sims, any of the Sims series, it's about creating a life, having a family. You can do whatever you want in that game. It's basically about being an adult, which is a great escape for a kid because that's all most kids ever talk about is talking about wanting to be an adult or wanting to, go out into the world on their own so they don't have any parents that are telling them what to do. And I have to think that if you have a child that's pressured either to get a job, most parents, when my generation was about getting a job, being president or an astronaut or something like that, try and make sure you don't ever have to struggle. And then I'm just thinking, well, how much pressure does that apply on the kid? And then when that kid like gets sucked into video games, most of my friends played Sims or some type of game where they created their reality to the point where they wouldn't hang out with other friends because they liked playing Sims. I'm at fault for doing it at times too. It's fun, but it's also a video game. So it's like, could that be the similar things, much like, maladaptive daydreaming is not an intensity where you're actually experiencing it. And I understand that there's different intensities. I think mine are pretty intense, but I've heard some stories from some people. But Sims is a great, quick thing where you don't need a lot of creativity and it doesn't seem like it's daydreaming because you're playing a game, but essentially you're thinking about what you're going to do next and you're kind of developing what the story is going to be. Should I do this? Is that going to lead to this or this or this? Or should I do this and that's going to lead to this and this and this? What happens if my Sim's an astronaut? And then you're putting yourself, visualizing yourself in that position. So I'm curious if you have any data that shows that video games can be masking some types of diagnoses or diagnoses of, maladaptive daydreaming or a form of daydreaming, or is that might be creating it? I mean, it's not a trauma experience, but it is an experience that can introduce someone to the subject of now all you're thinking about is your video game and living in that digital world that you created. You could be at work thinking about it because you like that video game so much.
Right, right. Well, I see one very clear similarity between this experience in maladaptive daydreaming or immersive daydreaming, and that is the escapism. That is the motivation here is quite similar to be in a different reality that is distracting, that is immersive, that is engulfing you. And sometimes acting through avatars, so not being you, being someone else, creating protagonists and images that you are their master and their the director, and um, so there is a great similarity there in terms of function. So this is also an activity that can lead to addiction, in a sense that people want more and more of it, and when that comes at the expense of achieving and promoting your own goals in life, that can become a problem. The other similarity is, of course, the escape to fantasy. What differentiates between the two is simply the ability to do it in your mind. That is characteristic of people with immersive and maladaptive daydreaming. In these computer games, the visualization is in front of you, is given to you. Still, you need, I guess, there's a lot of room for creativity, and you can get immersed in this world that you create. These are multiplayer activities. So you interact with others whom actually you don't know, you don't need to know, and all the avatars are fictional. So this too is about the motivation to create an alternate reality and escape from the current reality. And the question, of course, is why? Why do that? What is the motivation of people to prefer living in an alternate world rather than in this world? And this reminds me of another phenomenon that we recently reported in the scientific literature. It's called reality shifting. It's also a new trend that spiked when COVID was announced as a as a threat, as a health threat by the World Health Organization. So around that time, we see a spike in Google searches for the term shifting or reality shifting, and what that involves is Generation Z people trying to induce themselves into what they believe is a parallel world. Some of them will go as far as believing that this sort of is a quantum phenomena in which they actually can jump into a parallel world. But the idea is that they are trying to induce themselves. So the practices that they are describing online of getting into this reality shifting experience reminds some of us scholars of consciousness of hypnotic inductions. So they try to concentrate, relax, and use self-affirmations and sort of hypnotically inductive words and techniques in order to shift the reality. And there is, when we study this, the chatter in these communities, we realize that some people can't do it because apparently they're not endowed with self-hypnotic abilities. So there are leaders there who promote this and teach others how to do it, and many are capable of doing it to various degrees of success and satisfaction, and others are frustrated because they can't get there to their ultimate. But again, this is another modern age phenomena that is associated with the motivation to escape something that is always characterized, I guess, youth who wanted to experiment with altered state of consciousness or rebel and be and explore experiences. And now in the age of the internet, people can easily teach each other, talk to each other about these experiences and how to get them. So these are different forms of a similar motivation, not to be here, to shape and alter the experience. And when we talk about experience, that actually means consciousness. Not to be here, but to be elsewhere without substances. That is sort of a self-hypnotic, consciousness-altering experience. That to me is very interesting.
Now, are you seeing like certain generations that are experiencing it more? Like, is it becoming more frequent? I know like it's not accepted into the DSM criteria, which is a shame. I'd like to raise awareness on that, but there's my generation, I mean, everyone has regrets. Everyone has something that they would like to go back in time and fix. Whether it's wanting to ask out a girl, I would think if you had social anxiety, you would try and think of the best way possible that you could do it and run multiple scenarios in your head. But we don't look at that as like we don't look at that as daydreaming. We don't look at that as anything. We just kind of look at it like, oh, you're just anxious. And then we kind of gloss it off to the side. So I wonder if we raise awareness on it, get it recognized, and more things that people would just be like, oh, you're just a kid and grow out of it. Same thing like it was for me with ADHD. Once it starts becoming recognized, you're going to have things that maybe even better treatments to be able to help people that get stuck in these experiences as well, too. I mean, raising your mental well-being is not insane thinking. I think everyone has regrets and everyone has depression and things that cause them to escape from reality because life is tough. But it's about when it becomes so impactful to where you can't experience life anymore. And now this alternate reality is where you always want to go, which becomes a problem. I think it's healthy to go there sometimes. I enjoy it, but it's also knowing that there's a distinctive line between fantasy and then the reality part to it. So I think it can be taught in a beneficial way, but if we don't educate on it, if we don't talk about it, then how are people going to know what they're experiencing? And then they get stuck in that loop. They get stuck in that pit and they can't really get out.
Well, what is of concern is that, I hear reports, people write me, I see the chatter online of, of people struggling with this excessive fantasy disorder, and they reach out for help. And then, of course, since it's not in any of the main psychiatric manuals, it's not in the DSM, it's not in the ICD, it's simply unrecognized, and often mental health professionals will diagnose the other concomitant comorbid disorders, because maladaptive daydreaming, as we know, we started our conversation, is associated with other problems. So, so people who come to get help and they get diagnosed for something else, not for this mental addiction, that is of concern. Some, of course, also, as you suggested, get a reaction of dismissal. It's nothing. Everybody daydreams. Just get over it and don't worry about it. And that, of course, is an unempathic. It would be an unempathic reaction, because the patient has come to you for help because they are unhappy about it, they are concerned about it, they suffer. So this, to dismiss it as nothing is just an injustice. I can't blame the therapist, because it's not. I mean, it's not in the manuals. They're not trained to diagnose it. So that is a challenge. This is our challenge, and perhaps yours as a host of a internet talk show to promote awareness. This is why I was happy to accept your invitation to be your guest, because it's another opportunity to promote awareness of this form of excessive daydreaming. And our impression is that science speaks, the data speak, and we have accumulated by now dozens of good quality, sound, rigorous research studies that prove that maladaptive daydreaming is a reliable, distinct mental disorders that cannot be better explained by any of the existing disorders. It's unique, and therefore deserves a unique treatment. And we have some good news regarding treatment, because we just published a study. It was led by my doctoral student, now Dr. Oren Hersku, who conducted a randomized clinical trial offering individuals, those who were on the research arm or the experimental arm, not the control arm, some specific skills, such as increasing their motivation to change it, because it's an addiction, so, and highly rewarding. So you need to be highly motivated to remind yourself of the cost of not changing it and the benefits of controlling this better. Offering them simple techniques for self-monitoring, because people are sometimes just not aware of how much time they spend in their fantasy world, and offering them a technique that will help them be present. It's called mindfulness. It's now a very popular therapeutic technique that is applied in many other disorders. Mindfulness training, that is, and people need to learn to do it, because, as you said, from your own personal experience, you don't notice how much time goes by and how quickly time flies when you are daydreaming. You can be engaged in rigorous exercise for hours when you do that. So that is just an illustration of how unaware sometimes people can be of the amount of time, and that aids them in dismissing the gravity of the situation. So when they monitor the amount of time that they spend in daydreaming, they can also understand the patterns. So this intervention, this three-arm intervention, is extremely promising, because after only 8 sessions, online sessions, there was patient driven. So no therapist was involved. They were exposed to lessons, instructions, videos. They received homework, need to report it, but it was all without a therapist touch. And after only 8 sessions, we had significant improvements. Some of them were not did not meet the suggested diagnostic criteria for maladaptive daydreaming at the end and at a 6-month follow-up. So we followed it up to see if these are durable changes. So there is hope, and obviously we talked about this as self-medication, as a behavior that is designed to regulate distress. So obviously, undoubtedly, a comprehensive, thorough therapy for maladaptive daydreaming needs to address not only the addiction, but also the cause for the addiction, if there is a cause. Social anxiety, sadness, depression, whatever. There's not always an underlying cause, but often there is. It explains, why people prefer not to be present, but elsewhere. So a combination of a technique that helps people control better the urge, the yearning to escape, with dealing with the underlying issues, to my mind, can offer great hope and help for people who are struggling with this disorder. There's good news there too. And of course, the fact that there is therapy for it also adds to the validity of this construct and makes it a good candidate to be included in one of the future editions of the DSM, for example.
Do you find newer researchers that are open to the idea of maladaptive daydreaming? Like if I was a client and I walked in and said, "Can you look up maladaptive daydreaming? I think I have it." Are they going to actually take the time to do so? I find that with younger researchers or younger health professionals, that they're more open to an idea like that before. And I'm wondering if this type of daydreaming is actually getting recognized to the point where you're having people that go, I've heard of that. I'm going to look it up and see what we can possibly do. Because I feel like a lot of times they always look for something that's more like a basic one that would be more diagnosed, like ADHD or something like that, which is now getting recognized. But then there's other things, like maybe you have depression or maybe you have anxiety. I have so many friends that are on anxiety and depression pills, where I'm like, is that 100% what you have, or they just tell you that and then you kind of take it? I'm not saying anything at the professionals, but there is obviously a patient workload that happens over to doctors, and they're trying to figure out how to help you with the time that they have as well too. And I start going, do we have anybody who's open to new ideas? Is that a new field, a new generation that's coming into the medical system or healthcare system that's looking at, okay, I've heard that. And I would think with the internet, there's probably a lot of things that are able to pop up that can show you. It doesn't mean you have to take it as health advice. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying there's so many ideas now where if you just Google it, you're going to find something about it. And I guarantee you there's probably a community of people, much like with this subject, that are talking about it, where it's like, okay, it is a real thing. It's just not recognized.
I'm telling you, there's a subreddit. I guess many of our listeners know what Reddit is. So it has a subgroup dedicated to maladaptive daydreaming. I think it has over 90,000 members in this community, and that's just one community. There's a great need for people struggling with it to discuss, to talk, to get peer support because professionals don't recognize it enough. I would say it's a process. Look, the term was coined in 2002. It was the first time it was mentioned in the literature. So it's a very young and emerging disorder. So if you would Google it in 2002, you would find 0 results. Now you get something like 300,000 hits. So people talk about it, it's mentioned, it's discussed, and best of all, there are a few dozen good research papers out there. So what I would suggest to people who watch your show and are concerned that they or a loved one has maladaptive daydreaming is to Google 3 words, maladaptive daydreaming research, that's 3 words. And on the first page, probably the first hit on the first page would be our research website. And on our research website, go to the publication tab, and that's it, and show it to your doctor. The publication tab has all the research studies, papers, and they are accessible, they're downloadable. So that's the, if your doctor is not concerned about, or let me put it differently, if your doctor is open to learn and to learn from you and to admit that there's something that she or he don't know, then you're on a good track. Most doctors would be interested because it's not good practice to ignore science. So maladaptive daydreaming research. Google it. That's where your resources are on our. It's called the International Consortium for Maladaptive Daydreaming Research. It's a group of researchers who promote this, collaborate, and our publications are there for the public to read.
Can I ask what your biggest challenge is so far with just this type of research?
Well, there are two challenges. The first one, we know this starts in childhood. We would like to be able to identify this as early as possible because we get a lot of emails and calls from parents who say, look, my child is doing this, they're walking about, they're talking to themselves, they seem lost in their own world for hours, and they talk about their imaginary friends, but they'd rather do that than do their homework, and they look, because they're children, they are not self-conscious, so they look odd to others. And there's nothing to offer them. And these children grow up to be adults. And for those who develop maladaptive daydreaming, that's a shame, because years of embarrassment and suffering and dysfunction could have been avoided if this were to be detected earlier. So the biggest challenge right now is to do research with children. This is, of course, always complex because you need to have the cooperation of the parents and the parental consent, but that's one direction that we are working hard to promote: early identification and early intervention. And the other is related to I would say, the gold standard of mental health research, is to find the objective evidence that this form of daydreaming is unique. And that could be done by studying electrical activities of the brain or doing brain imaging studies while people are daydreaming under the scanners, while in the brain scanners, and to compare them to how the brain functions when they are instructed to pay attention to external stimuli, and compare them to people who are not endowed with this trait. Once you present the scientific world with hard objective data, not self-report, that is the gold standard for really establishing the validity of a disorder. So we're looking for research partners who have access to these very expensive brain scanning machines, or who would be interested to collaborate with us. We're not there yet.
Do you find that it's just because there's not a cemented name that's funding some of these studies? Like, you have a lot of people that are independently researching it and having papers published, but what about like if you had like a concrete, well-known name that solidified it? I mean, your name is respected. I'm not saying that. I mean, like an institution that was like, this is a 100% study. I feel like more people would look into it because of that. I mean, you could have a bunch of papers published, but if I don't know if people are reading the names, or certain individuals are looking at the name and they're just looking for something that they know to be like, well, they signed off on it, then that's kind of the in that you guys have.
It's always good to have a renowned scientist involved, but ultimately what talks are the data, the results. So you can, I would be happy to conduct such a brain scanning study with a junior researcher. If the results would be good, it'll be accepted to talk to good journals. But these are expensive studies, just to run to run somebody under such a scanner, it costs a lot of money. And our young and emerging field is just getting funded. A colleague of mine in Israel received a nice, handsome grant to do it, but she will not focus on brain imaging. But once we get funded by the establishment, we'll be able to promote it. A shortcut, as I said, would be to have a scientist who is a neurologist who has access to these machines and who is interested. Maybe somebody who struggles with immersive daydreaming. That would be a good candidate.
Do you know? I feel like, well, that's how people end up educating themselves on it, is when they realize what they're experiencing it is either that, or if you have like a parent, usually if they have a kid that suffers with it or has it and they heard about it, they'll start doing a lot of research, and it has to affect you for someone to actually want to go and search into it. But do you know why movement somehow amplifies the daydream experience that they have?
Well, that's a paper that just of mine that just got accepted for publication. So yes, I have some idea about that. So as you imply, maladaptive daydreaming and immersive daydreaming, the non-pathological variant of this, involves two very distinct behaviors. One of them is the exposure to music. Music is very important to many people with this. It sort of sets, it's like the soundtrack of a movie. So it sets the mood, so activates the body. It's very important to, not to all, but to many. And movement is extremely important to most, not all, but to most people with maladaptive daydreaming. In fact, one collaboration that we're developing as we speak is with child neurologists who treat children with what they call stereotypical movement disorder. They have discovered that many of the children who meet the diagnostic criteria for stereotypic movement disorder actually report that they fantasize. They daydream while they're doing it, and it's a lot of fun. So somehow we read each other literature, we started talking, and now we are convinced that we're actually the childhood antecedents of maladaptive daydreaming were right there in plain sight. They just called it stereotypical movement disorder. We are confident that it's the same thing. And now we are launching a study of children with stereotypical movement disorder who have this stereotypical behaviors of rocking, pacing, twirling an object in their hand, mouthing, and we're going to follow them up to adulthood. It's also possible to have someone who was diagnosed in childhood and they are now a few years ago, and to catch them as adults and see if they meet the diagnostic criteria of maladaptive daydreaming. So I don't know, I don't remember what your question was, but I got excited about it because that's exactly what we're doing now. So I don't know if I answered your question.
You did. It was just about movements and why the intensity increases
Oh,
up.
movements, right. So, okay. So one function of the movement is to enhance concentration. No, I didn't answer your question. Now I'm answering it. One function of movement is to enhance concentration. So people sort of rock back and forth, and it sort of helps them deepen their fantasy. That's one type of movement. And another category of movement are movements that are embodiments of the fantasy. So they would throw punches in the air, they would gesture, they would grimace, they would mouth their, and that would be an actual physical manifestation of the fantasy that they are playing in their mind. So these are two types of movement. But you hit it right on the nail right on the head. It's extremely it's highly characteristic of maladaptive daydreaming. And of course, to the unsuspecting eye, people who do this might look odd to the onlookers. So that's why people with maladaptive daydream prefer to normalize their movement by exercising, jogging, power walking, or they seek solitude. They just don't want to be observed.
No, when I found the research about that, or when I saw that there was movements of a repetitive manner, I thought back to this kid in my class who had autism, and he would always rock back and forth in his chair.
Right.
And no one, everyone would kind of wonder why, but now it kind of makes sense if he's living in his own little daydream thing. I would have to think that anything that brings you out to an escape, and maybe that's why some of it gets linked in with the autism stuff as well too, is because it's like a repetitive manner as well too. I mean, ADHD, I know they say it's not on the spectrum and stuff, and I have it. I don't want to say that I'm autistic at all, but when you start looking at like some similarities with it, you start going, okay, there's a few things here where it's like the impulsivity, there's a lot of social masking to make sure you're not showing a piece of yourself or anything that could be, I don't want to say society accepted. When it comes to the manner that you're supposed to be acting, you know what to act like in public compared to what you can act like in private. Everyone has that, but I feel like with ADHD, you have to censor it a little bit more. So I think normalization is really important because like talking about this type of stuff, the way it can be described as well too, can kind of sound nuts if it's just a single experience, but that's just because we haven't been educated on it as a public. Once you start realizing there's a whole community of people that probably have similar experiences, it normalizes it, and which is probably one of the most important things that we can honestly do, just so we can actually talk about it, educate on it, and then people will be more receptive to it.
I agree.
Well, Mr. Somer, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show, but is there a place where people can find any papers that you have published or any links that you would like to provide?
Oh, as I said, it's all out there, available and downloadable. Just Google Maladaptive Daydreaming Research, and you'll find our website, International Consortium for Maladaptive Daydreaming Research. And if you want to ask me a question, I hope I won't, I'm not shooting myself in the foot. You can Google Eli Somer, find me, and if the question is short, I might, I in all likelihood answer you.
Okay, and I'm going to link all your links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blanket. Stay tuned for our next episode.